We're looking today at a situation that unfolded in Los Angeles, days of really intense protests gripping parts of the city.
Right. And the trigger for all this, the immediate spark, seems to be reports of um, immigration raids by federal officers,
Yeah.
ICE raids.
Yeah, exactly. And our sources, the material we've got here, it paints a pretty dramatic picture. Protests starting off, peacefully, but then escalating.
Definitely escalating. We see reports of vehicles set on fire, clashes with police, that kind of thing.
And this led to a really major and, well, frankly, controversial federal response.
Huge response. Thousands of National Guard troops deployed, even U.S. Marines put on alert.
Which then, of course, kicked off this political fight, legal battle, too, between Washington and California.
Yeah, a real clash.
So, our job today really is to take all the source material you've shared with us and just unpack it for you. We want to help you navigate what happened, maybe why it escalated like it did, who the key players were.
And explore some of the bigger questions this whole situation raises about federal power, states' rights, immigration enforcement, all of that.
Exactly. It's a complex one, isn't it?
It really is. But we'll go through it bit by bit. Pull out the key facts, the different perspectives from the sources so you can get a clearer view.
Okay. So, based on the material, where do we start? What was the absolute beginning?
The sources really point to Friday as the ignition point. Protests started to bubble up then. It was reports coming out about immigration and customs enforcement, ICE conducting operations.
And where were these happening specifically?
The reports mentioned areas with large Latino populations, specifically the Westlake district of LA and also the city of Paramount.
Paramount, that's just south of LA, right?
Yeah, and the sources make a point of noting its demographics over 82% Hispanic population. So, kind of a context for the community impact.
That's a really key detail. Wasn't there also a specific report about a Home Depot in Paramount?
There was a reported raid there. It's interesting because officials apparently told the BBC later that specific report, the Home Depot one, was false.
Oh, okay.
But the sources say that location still became a major protest site anyway.
Huh. It just shows how quickly things can catch fire, doesn't it? Even based on initial reports, maybe rumors.
Absolutely. Perception and reality kind of clashing there.
So, what about the confirmed ICE activity? Did the sources give numbers for that Friday?
They did. ICE gave details later, according to CBS News.
Yeah.
On that Friday, they said 44 unauthorized immigrants were arrested in just one operation at a single job site.
Okay, 44 in one go.
And then separate from that, another 77 arrests across the wider LA area, same day.
So, over 120 people just on Friday.
Yes, significant numbers.
And the sources place this in the context of, well, President Trump's overall immigration policy, right?
Exactly. The material frames it as part of his stated goal for the, quote, biggest deportation operation in U.S. history, his crackdown pledge.
So these LA raids weren't random. They're seen as part of that bigger strategy.
That's how the sources present it, yes.
Okay, so that's Friday, the spark. How did things develop over the weekend? Because the sources suggest it really shifted.
It really did. What started as demonstrations became, well, much more volatile. The peaceful element was still there, but overshadowed.
Where was the focus of the unrest?
Mostly downtown LA. Things got intense enough that police declared parts of downtown an unlawful assembly area.
And what kind of incidents are we talking about, according to the sources?
Some pretty serious stuff.
Yeah.
On Sunday, reports of vehicles being set on fire. Police accused protesters of using incendiary devices, specifically against horse patrols.
Wow. Okay.
We saw police in riot gear using flashbang grenades, pepper spray, trying to disperse crowds.
And didn't protesters shut down a freeway at one point?
Yeah, the 101 freeway, temporarily blocked by demonstrators. And sadly, there were also reports of looting mixed in with the protests.
It sounds like the downtown Federal building was a real focal point, too.
Definitely. There were claims, allegations that ICE detainees were being held inside. ICE itself put out a statement saying that on Saturday, they believed over 1,000 rioters surrounded the building and attacked it.
1,000. That's a specific claim.
It is. And that Home Depot in Paramount we mentioned, it wasn't just protests there. The sources described clashes on Saturday, police deploying tear gas and flashbangs there as well.
So unrest in multiple locations.
Yes. And by Sunday, you had armed National Guard troops actually seen guarding a business park near that Home Depot site in Paramount.
And arrest numbers, did the LAPD release figures?
They did. For the weekend, 29 arrests reported on Saturday and another 27 on Sunday.
So dozens arrested just by LAPD over those 2 days.
And the material also briefly mentions some unrest up in San Francisco on Sunday. About 60 arrests there, 3 officers injured.
Okay, so not totally isolated to LA, but LA was the main event.
Clearly the main focus, yeah.
And then what about Monday? Did things calm down?
Protests continued, according to reports. Police apparently used stun grenades again on Monday. But the sources do note that later in the day, the overall level of unrest seemed to decrease. Fewer violent incidents, smaller crowds than the weekend peak.
Right. And it's probably important to remember, as the sources point out, that this was happening in specific areas.
Absolutely. Much of LA, a huge city, was carrying on as normal. The LA Pride Parade, for instance, went ahead over the weekend in areas that were closed for that event.
Okay, so while this intense situation was developing on the ground, the federal government made its move, a big one.
A very big one. This is where President Trump ordered the deployment of troops.
You said thousands. Can you break down those numbers from the sources?
Sure. On Saturday, the first wave was 2,000 members of the National Guard sent to the LA area.
2,000. Okay.
And on Monday evening, another order came down, an additional 2,000 National Guard members. And on top of that, the Pentagon called up 700 active duty U.S. Marines to assist.
Wow, 700 active duty Marines. That feels like a major step.
It is. And the controversy really swirls around the National Guard deployment. Can you maybe explain what the Guard is based on the sources?
Yeah, the sources explain it as this kind of hybrid force. It serves both the state and the federal government. But crucially, and this is the point the material emphasizes, the Guard is usually activated by and reports to the state's governor.
Right, at the governor's request.
And President Trump didn't do that here. He bypassed the governor.
Exactly. The sources are clear on this. He didn't wait for Governor Newsom of California, didn't ask for his permission. Instead, the reporting suggests he used a rarely used federal law.
And what was his justification for using that law?
He argued, according to the sources, that the protests amounted to a form of rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States.
Rebellion. That's strong language.
Very strong. And the sources add some historical context here. This deployment reportedly is the first time a president has activated the Guard without the state governor's request since 1965.
1965. Wow. Okay. That really underscores how unusual this action was described as being.
Definitely. And that unusual nature immediately sparked a whole new conflict.
Yeah, moving from the streets into politics and the courts.
California officials reacted incredibly strongly, very quickly. Governor Newsom, LA Mayor Karen Bass both condemned the deployment publicly.
What was their main argument, according to the sources?
Their view was that local law enforcement, the LAPD primarily, was capable of handling the situation. They felt this federal intervention was, well, unnecessary and maybe even provocative.
Governor Newsom used some particularly sharp words, didn't he? The sources quoted him.
They did, calling the deployment illegal, saying it was putting fuel on this fire, and yeah, even calling the action deranged.
So, strong words, but did they take action beyond that?
Oh, yes. Immediate legal action. The sources detailed that the state of California filed a lawsuit on Monday.
A lawsuit against the federal government. On what grounds?
Their argument, based on the material, is that President Trump's order violated the U.S. Constitution. Specifically, the protections for states' rights under the 10th Amendment.
The 10th Amendment. Remind us quickly what that covers.
It essentially says that any powers the Constitution doesn't specifically give to the federal government or deny to the states are reserved for the states or the people.
So California is saying controlling the Guard within its borders is one of those reserved state powers.
That's the core of their legal argument, yes. California's Attorney General, Rob Bonta, is quoted. He called the deployment an inflammatory escalation unsupported by conditions on the ground and said flatly it exceeds the federal government's authority.
Okay. But the sources must have included the federal perspective too, right? How did they defend it?
They did. Trump allies defended the move. They saw the protests as a genuine threat to federal authority and federal property, like that building downtown. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is mentioned, noting that those 700 Marines were put on high alert, ready to go if needed.
Although reports indicated they weren't actually sent into LA for policing duties, right?
That's right. They were on alert, but seemingly not deployed onto the streets themselves in that capacity.
And the sources also clarified something about the law governing domestic use of troops.
Yeah, they mentioned there's a general law, the Posse Comitatus Act, that usually prohibits using federal military troops for civilian law enforcement. And separate from that is the Insurrection Act, which allows it in specific extreme circumstances. The sources confirm Trump did not invoke the Insurrection Act here.
Okay, so he used that other rarer statute instead.
Correct, which is central to the legal fight.
The sources also included a poll, didn't they? Just for context on public opinion about the underlying policy.
Yeah, a CBS News YouGov poll from early June, so just before these specific LA protests blow up, it showed 54% approval for Trump's overall deportation policy and 50% approval for his handling of immigration more broadly.
Which contrasted with lower numbers on the economy, apparently.
Right. Just a snapshot of public sentiment around that time, according to the source material.
Okay. So let's try and tie these threads together. We've got the raids, the protests, the violence, the massive federal troop deployment, the state pushback. If we connect these dots based on what the sources are telling us, what's the bigger picture here?
Well, it strongly reinforces, based on the material, that these events in LA are seen as fitting directly into President Trump's larger stated aim, that biggest deportation operation goal we talked about.
And LA is a key location for that. Why specifically?
The sources highlight its demographics. Over a third of the population in Los Angeles County is foreign born. So it's just statistically a major center for immigrant communities.
And the sources mentioned previous ICE operations there too.
They did. For example, one back in early May where ICE announced arresting 239 people in the LA area. So it's an ongoing focus.
And the White House has actually upped the targets for ICE, haven't they?
Apparently so. The sources mention an increased goal of aiming for at least 3,000 arrests per day nationwide, a big jump.
3,000 a day. Wow.
Yeah. And the sources also note that the targets for these raids seem to be expanding, increasingly looking at workplaces like restaurants, retail shops.
Which could explain operations like the one that reportedly sparked things off in LA.
Exactly. And this whole campaign has involved some controversial actions mentioned in the sources, like sending some migrants to a mega prison facility down in El Salvador. The sources noted this included at least one person who was reportedly in the U.S. legally.
Which raises more questions.
It does. And the material points out that many of these immigration actions have faced legal challenges. So there's a pattern of pushback in the courts, too.
And just to be clear, what was the stated role of the troops deployed in LA according to the federal government's explanation in the sources?
Their specific, defined mission, as reported, was to protect federal personnel like ICE agents, DHS officers, while they were doing their jobs.
So, not to conduct immigration raids themselves.
Correct. And not to perform regular city policing duties. That distinction, protecting federal agents versus general law enforcement, is pretty crucial, especially for the legal arguments.
Right. Wow. Okay. It really is a situation with so many intense layers, isn't it? You've got the direct impact of these large scale enforcement actions hitting a community.
Then the community's reaction, which
Yeah.
escalated very quickly and dramatically.
And then layered on top is this unprecedented clash between the state and federal government over using the military domestically.
It's a lot to take in.
So we've walked you through the information in the source material, the initial raids, the escalating unrest on the streets, that really significant federal troop deployment, and then the legal and political fallout between California and DC.
Yeah. Hopefully, laying out the different viewpoints, the sequence of events, and the core arguments presented in the sources helps you make sense of it all.
It certainly highlights the complexity, doesn't it? Multiple perspectives, all clashing.
Absolutely. There's definitely a lot to digest here from the material provided. And maybe thinking about this specific confrontation, the fight over using federal military power against the governor's wishes, and coupling that with the different ideas presented in the sources about how to handle domestic unrest and how to enforce immigration policy on this scale, it does raise a pretty fundamental question for you to think about based solely on what we've discussed from these sources. What does this specific clash over authority happening right now amidst these major policy shifts and clear public dissent suggest about the current balance of power within the U.S. system itself, particularly between the federal government and the states?
A very big question indeed. Lots to ponder there. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the source material.